Thank you for joining us today at Hope Church. We exist to connect people to live the life of a Jesus follower. We hope you enjoy the service.
There are two types of people when it comes to instructions. There are the types of people who, when the package comes, the IKEA box or whatever it is, you open it up and you go right for the instruction manual, right? You want to go step by step. You want to make sure that you put everything together in order so that you can get it right. Then there are the other types of people, the sociopaths who say, I'm just going to figure it out. Let's just see how this thing goes. These are typically the people that you see on the news that they've committed some crime that you didn't even know was a thing, right? These are the two types of people. But listen, your preference for instructions goes out the window when it becomes life or death, right? Like when it's a life or death situation and your ability to follow instructions means life or death, all of a sudden you start to prefer instructions a little bit more. Am I right? Like we want to follow instructions a little bit more when our life is on the line. A silly illustration of this is, but this shows up in movies. I think probably maybe the greatest trilogy of its generation, the Terminator movies, the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. By the way, can we just be honest? Arnold Schwarzenegger, the most underrated actor of his generation, right? How does that guy not have an Oscar nomination? I mean, come on. But the line in it, and I'll just say it the way that Arnold says it, the line that is in every single one of these movies throughout the entire trilogy is, "Come with me if you want to live," right? Like that's the line. That's the whole setup is like, man, if you want to live, if you want to make it out alive, you got to trust that this person has the information, has the answers that is actually going to lead you to safety, that is actually going to keep you safe. A real life illustration of this actually just happened this year. There was a commuter jet flying from the Bahamas to Florida. You guys remember this story? The pilot passed out. The pilot passes out in the flight, and a guy gets on the intercom, and he calls the tower, and he's like, this is actually, the guy was way calm. If you actually listened to the whole thing, he was super calm. I would have been freaking out, but he was like, I've got a serious situation. The pilot just passed out, and I don't know how, I've never flown a plane. I don't know how to fly a plane. And so they basically gave him step-by-step instructions for how to land this plane. Now, you better believe that this guy listened to all those instructions, right? Every single step. He listened to every bit of every instruction that was given to him and followed it to a T. Well, today we're going to be we're taking a break from our series in Mark to look at a passage in Exodus that is on the Passover, and we're going to be primarily in Exodus chapter 11 and 12 today. But this whole story is about God's people's ability to follow instructions. Their salvation depends on their ability to receive instructions, to hear instructions, and to follow them to a T. So we're gonna be primarily in Exodus chapter 11 and 12 today. So if you have your Bible, you can turn there. But I'm just gonna start in chapter 1 to just kind of catch us up to what's going on here. Here's what's happening with the Israelites. They are living in Egypt. Joseph had been governor of Egypt, and basically God had used him to establish kind of welfare with the Pharaoh at the time. That they had become relationally close, and it was a blessing for God's people to be able to live in Egypt. And so they are thriving. They have grown in number. They have actually grown great in number. And as generations have passed now, there is a new Pharaoh that is there, and he's looking at all these Israelites living in Egypt, and he's not too excited about the situation. Listen to what he says in verse 8 of chapter 1. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. Therefore, they sent taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. So here's what has happened. The Israelites have enjoyed generations of well-being in Egypt, but now they have become slaves. And their suppressor fancies himself to be a god and is ruthless toward them, kind of like dogs who live in a house with cats, right? You will be controlled and you will be very afraid. Like this ruthless, and thinks he's a god. That also describes a cat. So that also explains why he had cats, I guess. So, but this Pharaoh is holding them in slavery. He is their oppressor. And any group, like any group who has been oppressed, they have no voice. What happens in Exodus is that God raises up a messenger right under the nose of Pharaoh, quite literally. Pharaoh's daughter adopts a Hebrew boy whom she names Moses, even though at the time her evil dad was trying to weaken the Israelites by murdering all their baby boys. But his daughter finds a baby Israelite boy, a Hebrew boy, and adopts him as her own. And so Pharaoh's plan to weaken them ultimately fails, and years later he finds himself listening to his adopted grandson speaking on behalf of the people that he despises the most. So Moses goes before Pharaoh, and he says to Pharaoh, this is I think the literal translation from the Hebrew. He says, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh baby, let my people go. Yeah, no, that's not. It's a children's song. Not the literal translation, but that's the gist. That's basically what happens is 9 times Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, Yahweh, the one true God, says, let my people go that they may go and worship me. And 9 times Pharaoh refuses. Each time, God sends a plague to demonstrate his power over this supposed God king, and each time, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. Finally, after all of the warning shots, God has had enough, and it comes down. There's one final plague that will be delivered, and this is what we see it is in chapter 11, verse 4. Moses said, thus says the Lord, about midnight, I will go out in the midst of Egypt, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, even to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the handmill, and the firstborn of the cattle. There shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been nor will ever be again. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. And all these your servants shall come down to me and bow down to me, saying, get out, you and all the people who follow you. And after that, I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in hot anger. Any of you parents ever experienced hot anger? You say the same thing over and over and over again, and it's like they just do not listen. You say the same thing over and over to your kids, and they just don't listen. This is what Moses is feeling. He has told Pharaoh over and over and over again, and Pharaoh has hardened his heart, and he has not listened. And now he's saying, look, I'm not going to warn you again. God is done warning you. God is about to strike you in a way that you won't be able to excuse or get over. It's going to leave a permanent mark on you, but not on us. Not on us. No, not even your dogs are going to bark against us. God is going to make a distinction between you and me. So what is this distinction between Egypt and Israel? How is it that God will execute his righteous judgment on Pharaoh's people, but not on his own? Chapter 12. And I'm just going to read these first 13 verses, and then we're just going to break all this down. Here is the plan for how to deal with this earthly god, this Pharaoh. Verse 1, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. Meaning everything's about to change from here. This is not the end, this is the beginning. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel, then on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for the households. You see that? There's a lamb to be taken for each individual household. That's a lot of lambs for an entire nation. And if the household is too small for the lamb, then he and his nearest neighbors shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat, you shall make your count for the lamb. So the size of the lamb to be provided for the number of people that you have in the household. And if you don't have enough people in your house, you work together with your neighbors. Your lamb, listen, your lamb shall be without blemish, a male, a year old. Specific instructions. You may take it from the sheep or the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then, here's what you got to do. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses. The lintel is the beam that goes across the doorway threshold. Put it on the doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It's the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And all God's people said, right? Yes, super, yeah, you're like, I'm so glad to be at church today, right? Animals, sacrifice, blood, like this is great. Listen, here, I want to make sure that you don't miss these instructions. Very, very, very weighty. The blood of an unblemished lamb, a lamb without blemish. No marks on it. It cannot have had any defects. There can't be anything wrong. Meaning, this lamb's life needs to be a life where it was not harmed, where there was no consequence of a sinful world to affect this lamb. This lamb needs to be without blemish. And the blood of this unblemished lamb is to be smeared on the doorposts and the crossbeam that goes over the door. And it must be spread over the doorway of the same house in which they eat the lamb. Listen, they can't eat the lamb in the neighbor's house and then just come home because, you know, the neighbor's table is bigger than theirs. Listen, the act of trust by putting the blood on the outside, watch this, and the act of obedience by eating the meal properly on the inside must be done together. I just want to say this, and we got a lot of new faces in the room today, and I don't want you to hear me just coming at you, but I want you to know this. Coming to church and putting on a face, that's only part of the deal. God sees what's on the inside. He sees everything. And if you think that you can fake your way through a Christian life while everything on the inside is still gross and falling apart or filled with disobedience, you cannot fake your way. God sees everything. And that's not to say, hey, don't come to church. That's not to say that anybody in this room is judging you today. That's just for you to know that God sees everything. And you might be able to fool some people in a room. You cannot fool the God of the universe. He sees everything. The outward presentation is just part of it. God demands also inward obedience. So the act of trust by putting the blood on the outside and obeying to eat the meal properly on the inside, they have to be done together. All of the meat must be roasted. All of it is to be consumed either by mouth or by fire. No Tupperware, no leftovers. All of it has to be gone. All of it gone. Then unleavened bread. That means no yeast in your bread. No yeast. Why? For the same reason that he gives them instructions about what to wear at dinner. Basically what he's saying is you're not going to have time to figure out what sandals go best with what belt. You're going to have to leave in haste. You're not going to have time for your bread to rise. This is not a lackadaisical, relaxed meal where you just get to hang out and enjoy some time. Literally, the way that it's written is eat in anxious haste. like you would at Taco Bell, right? Nobody goes to Taco Bell and just like savors the moment, right? You just eat in anxious haste. He is saying this is not for pleasure. This is for salvation. There is an urgency behind all of this, and you need to get all of this right. Do you see how intense this is? If anything goes wrong, if you miss any of the instructions, if you don't have the proper covering, things are not going to go well for you and your household. Church, can you imagine the burden of responsibility for sacrificing for your own sins? Can you imagine that? I mean, can you imagine coming to church today and instead of a prayer time at the beginning, I say, I hope you brought your lambs today, right? Does everybody have your lamb? You got your lambs? We're gonna sing some songs. We'll give you a little short message, and then we're gonna go out to the parking lot, and we're gonna slaughter your lambs to cover your sin. Can you imagine the burden of that? I shared this a couple weeks ago, but Christy and I lived in a Muslim country. And, when you live in a Muslim country, you are faced with the reality that many parts of the world still offer animal sacrifice as a way of trying to deal with sin. We don't experience that here in our culture, and so this is a little bit of a foreign concept to us. But every year in the country that we lived in, they had a holiday called the Qurban Bayram. Every year they would sacrifice animals to cover their sins for the next year. Well, one of the years that we lived there, we had a good friend that he and his family went and they bought a goat. And by the way, there were slaughter stations set up, so they didn't just have people weren't just doing this in their kitchen. They had a station. It is the 21st century after all, and so they had stations set up. One of the stations happened to be across the street from our house, and much to the chagrin of my wife, but we got to see this firsthand, and so it was just an interesting thing. You'd be driving around town. You'd look over, and there'd just be a goat in the back seat of a car, and you just go, sorry, buddy, tomorrow's not going to be a good day for you. And so Christy did not enjoy that at all. But our friend, him and his family got this goat, and they put it in the back of their car, and they drove it home. And he's telling us this a couple days after Qurban Bayram, and he said they brought it home, and they put it out in their balcony and left it overnight. Well, it got super cold that night, and this goat died in the middle of the night. And so on Qurban Bayram, when they're supposed to go take their goat for sacrifice, they open up the door and their goat is stiff as a board, 4 legs up in the air, and that's not going to do you any good at that point. And I said, well, hey man, what'd you do? This is a big deal. And he's like, man, we don't know. We're just this has never happened to our family before, and we're just hoping that Allah will give us a pass this year, because this is, what can you do? And I was like, man, isn't that tough to know that your entire hope for security is based on you and your actions? All contingent on whether or not this goat that's out on your back porch is going to survive the morning. Church, aren't you so thankful that we don't have that weighing on our shoulders? It's not contingent on us today. I want to give you today 3 points about God's salvation. 3 points out of this passage, and the first point that I want to give you is this. God offers one way to be saved, and it's His way. There's one way for you and I to be saved, and that's God's way. Do you realize that God could have chosen any other way to deliver His people from the Pharaoh? He could have chosen any number of ways to deliver His people. Why not just make everybody in Egypt go into a deep sleep, Everybody's sleeping, put some shaving cream on Pharaoh's hand, tickle his nose, and be on your way, right? There's got to be a better way than the killing of baby lambs, right? There's got to be a better way. And let's be honest, in our 21st century Western brains, there's a lot of things that seem better to us than the sacrifice of an animal. Why this bloodshed? That seems so antiquated. That seems so outdated. And while we might not have slaughter stations outside, and that might not be part of our morning ceremony, there's a lot of ways in which we're trying to save ourselves still today. Maybe for you, it's to be a good person. You think that if you're a good person at the end of the day, that God will look at you and maybe be pleased with you. If you can do enough good, that you be a good enough person, that God will be pleased with you. Maybe for you, salvation comes in the form of finding somebody else who is good. maybe a relationship. Maybe your entire goal is to pursue a relationship, have a marriage, have a relationship with somebody who is good, who will love you and give you that experience of love, and that will be your saving grace in life. Here's one that's not going to surprise you. Get your political party in office, right? Maybe if I can get my political party in office, then there will be security for me in the future. Listen, I want to tell you today that every earthly God will promise to save you, but will only in the end enslave you. Let me just say that again. Every earthly God will promise to save you, but will ultimately only enslave you. Any other thing that you look to in your life for rescue will ultimately let you down. It will provide a place for you. Yeah, it'll give you something temporarily, and it'll probably keep you busy. But it will enslave you. You be a good person. Well, then you're left with the question, how good is good enough? How good do you have to be good enough for a holy God? How good is that? How good in your life do you have to be to tip the scales, to have a holy God of the universe be pleased with you? Oh, well, I'll find a good person. I'll find a good person. Maybe that person will make me better. Well, here's the reality. Either that person will fail you or you will fail them. Either way, that burden is crushing in a relationship. And I don't even have to get started on politics, right? We can just see how explosive that is. I want to ask you today, who or what in your life is your taskmaster? Is it a person? Is it a situation? Is it a sin that you can't shake? What is it in your life that you have looked to for hope, for security, but instead has been inflicting you with heavy burdens? God's way is the only way to truly be delivered from the taskmasters of this world. And you say, well, Lance, I'm here at church today. I want God to save me. Well, I want to ask you today, are you obeying him? Are you obeying him? You see this instruction list that was given? It's weighty, it's deep. The stakes are high, life and death. Are you just throwing out the instruction manual of your Bible and just going, well, I'll just wing it. I'll just kind of make it through and I'll figure it out as I go and hope when I get to the end that it'll all work out? Let me ask it this way. Are you trying to obey God just partially? You come to church, maybe regularly, you sing some songs, maybe occasionally you read your Bible, you pray over your meal, your Taco Bell, and you do a few of these things, but in all reality, the rest of your life is yours. Do you have partial obedience? I've got a 4-year-old, and we're starting to tell our 4-year-old all the time, partial obedience is still disobedience, right? You're either completely obedient or you're not obedient. Partial obedience is still saying, no, I want to hold something back. I want to maintain a little bit of control for me. No, God, I want the things that you have. I want to obey you maybe in the ways that are convenient for me, or obey you in the ways that I kind of like or I think are okay, but I'm not going to give you everything. There's some things that I'm going to hold back. Partial obedience is still disobedience. Let me state it another way. Partial trust is still mistrust, right? Like if you only partially trust the person that you are married to, but you still want to hold some things back, you're not going to have a very healthy relationship, right? If you're still kind of holding on to autonomy, but you aren't operating in complete trust, you're not going to have a very healthy relationship. And some of you today, you're here today, and yeah, you want God to save you. You want God, but you don't fully trust God. You haven't completely surrendered control of your life. Let me just say it this way. Cognitive recognition of power isn't the same thing as trusting that power to save you. Right? Mental recognition, intellectual awareness, you listening to a sermon or reading or understanding or maybe having some generic belief that the God of the Bible has power to save you isn't the same thing as you actually submitting yourself to trusting him to save you. That's not the same thing. That's intellectual awareness. It's mental. But it's not complete. It's only partial. You realize that none of the plagues before this one had called Israel to action? None of them. None of them required anything of Israel. They didn't have to do anything. God sent the plague. Moses went and made the appeal to Pharaoh. Pharaoh hardened his heart, and God sent the plague. Nothing was required of Israel until this last and final act. In this final act, God invites his people to demonstrate their trust in him by obeying his command. And in obeying, they demonstrate belief in the one thing that God had wanted them to know all along. And he says it in verse 12, that I am the Lord. He is the Lord. I want to ask you today, in your battle against the taskmasters in your life, do you believe that Jesus is Lord or not? Is he on the throne of your life, or are you on the throne of your life? I want to ask you, who is calling the shots in your life? Who is the final decision maker in your life for what you do, where you go, what you say, what you eat, what you drink, where you sleep, how you live your life? Who is the one who has the final say in your life? Are you on the throne of your life? Are you sitting as Lord over your life, King of your life? Are you the one calling the shots and maybe trying to sprinkle some Jesus in here and there? Or is he the one who is on the throne? The 19th century missionary Hudson Taylor once wrote, Christ is either Lord of all or is not Lord at all. He is either Lord of all or he is not Lord at all. If you today have been settling for partial obedience, you need to see what's at stake. This is not just a run-of-the-mill situation. This is life or death. God offers one way to be saved. Are you trying to add to it? Take away from it, modify it? Nothing you do different will work, and nothing you neglect will go unnoticed. He alone is the Lord, and he offers one way to be saved. And it's his way. Point number 2 that we see from this passage is that the way to be saved is through the shedding of innocent blood. Now, we've been talking about this, and I just want to say, if this bothers you, I think that is kind of healthy and good. That's kind of a normal thing if this bothers you. My mother, Jan Michaels, is maybe the sweetest human on the planet. She hates this passage. The idea of a baby lamb, 1 year old, having to be slaughtered just tears her up inside. Listen, my mom is the lady who, when I was in high school regularly, she would pull over and stop the car and stop traffic behind us when she would see a turtle crossing the road. She would send her son out into traffic, into harm's way, to pick up the turtle and move it out of the road so that that turtle would be saved. My mom loves animals, and this whole idea of animal sacrifice, of slaughter, is really, really difficult for some people. I want to tell you, this was not the first time that innocent blood was shed to cover the exposure of sinful man. From the first moment that man sinned, we've been trying to cover our own skin. You realize that? If you read the end of Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve had just sinned. They had committed sin in the garden, and what do? They take fig leaves and they try to cover their own nakedness, right? It says that once their eyes were opened and they realized that they were naked, and there was shame that immediately they felt. And they went and they tried to cover themselves up with something temporary, something insufficient that couldn't do the job. And so when God comes along and he, in his grace and in his mercy towards them, he covers Adam and Eve's nakedness with the skins of an animal. Never before in the history of the world had blood been spilled. I mean, can you imagine the horror of knowing that the blood of this victim is on your hands? That it's your sin that caused its death? That the skin and fur that should be on one of God's living creatures is removed from its lifeless bodies so that your nakedness, which resulted from your sinfulness, can be covered? Can you even imagine? And now, years later, here in Exodus chapter 12, multiplied sinners results in multiplied victims and the need to cover many lambs slaughtered for the salvation of many people. And yet that is exactly what we see in this story, that the way to be saved is through the shedding of innocent blood. I want to tell you today, there is nothing in your life that you can do to save yourself. You do not have the capacity to save yourself today. The reason that you do not have the capacity to save yourself today, I don't care how good of a person you are. I don't care how perfect you pay your taxes, how great of how kind of a person you are, how nice you are to people, how much you give to charity. I don't care all the things. You are not perfect. You are not perfect. When I lived in Central Asia, I had a friend who owned a seed shop, and I would go down and hang out with him regularly. And one day we were in his seed shop, and I asked this question, hey, you believe God's holy, right? And he was like, yeah, I think God's holy. And I said, well, man, how then do you think is the way that we can be saved? How do you think that it's possible for us to be saved? And he said, well, I think of it kind of like a scale, I've done some bad things in my life. He said, I've got some things in my life that aren't so good, and so they've tipped the scale this way. But lately, I've been going and offering prayers. I've been trying to do it consistently 5 times a day. I've been nice to people. I've been fasting when we're supposed to fast. I've been doing all the things that I'm supposed to do. And so my hope is that the more of these things that I do throughout the rest of my lifetime, that it'll tip the scales. And some of you today, you may not have a background of Islam, and maybe you do. But maybe that's your thinking, is that maybe if you do enough good in your life, that somehow the scales will be tipped, and God will look at you and be pleased enough with you. Well, what I said to my friend is I said, hey, I went over to his shelf, and I said, hey, you got this water bottle here. Would you drink it? And he said, well, yeah. And I said, why would you drink it? And he said, well, it's water. And I said, how do you know it's water? He's like, well, it was there on my shelf, right? I put it there. I said, you would drink it because it's purified. You know that it's safe to drink. I said, how about this? What if I take this water and I open it up and I pour half of it out, and then I run up to the gas station and I fill up the other half with gasoline and I bring it back and I shake it up for you and I hand it to you. Would you drink it then? And he laughed, and he said, well, of course not. I said, why wouldn't you drink it? It's the same water bottle. It's the same vessel. You know where it came from. I've told you exactly what I've done. He said, well, it's got gasoline in it. It's toxic. And he was like, that's easy to see. And I said, okay, how about this? What if I just don't pour any out? And I go back into your bathroom and I just pee in it a little bit. Just a little bit. Not much, not half of it like I would the gasoline, just a little bit. And then I hand it back to you. Are you going to drink it then? No. No. You and I have a problem in that we are completely contaminated. It doesn't matter how good of a person you are, how much good you do, you have sin in your life. Every person, regardless of how good they are not perfect. You are not perfect today. You need a Savior. You need someone perfect to take your place, to be a perfect sacrifice for you. There's not a single person in this room who can save themselves. The only way to be saved is through the shedding of innocent blood. Point number 3. I'm going to set this back down here because I didn't expect to do that. Okay. Point number 3. God saves us from himself to himself. When Moses tells Pharaoh of this final plague in chapter 11, he says that there's going to be a distinction between Egypt and Israel. But in chapter 12, when Moses is telling the congregation of Israel about it, he doesn't say anything about the distinction. Why? Because the distinction was not based on their ethnicity or their cultural identity. The distinction was based on their trust and submission to God's singular plan for salvation. Let me just clarify that. Later on in Exodus 12, and this is one of the things I love about the Bible and I'm so grateful for, is we're not saved because of our ethnicity. We're saved because of Jesus. We're not saved, we are, the people that actually were led out of Egypt, the Bible describes it as a mixed multitude, meaning all the nations that were present, which probably included some Egyptians. There was representatives of every one of those nations who actually fled. It wasn't just the Israelites. It was a mixed multitude of multiple ethnicities, multiple backgrounds, multiple people. How were they saved? They were saved by obeying the command of the Lord. They knew the way to be saved. The reality is that Pharaoh didn't respond to the way to be saved. Anybody who was saved They responded in obedience to the command of the Lord, to put the blood over the doorpost, to consume the animal, to do everything exactly that way. Listen, on this night, there would really be only two types of people in Egypt. Those under the blood and those under the judgment of God. Those are the only two people. If they had stepped out from the covering of their home on this night, or they failed to follow any of the instructions, they would have been met with the same judgment as anyone else in Egypt. And some of you might be thinking, man, this is exactly who I thought God to be. This is the Old Testament God. This is the cruel, heartless, baby lamb killer Old Testament God, right? This is just validation for you that God is not to be trusted. He is a hateful, he is a cruel God. And if you feel this way, let me just say, I think fair. In this story, we have to accept the repulsiveness of the reality that, as one scholar put it, in every home there was either a dead lamb or a dead son. It should make us squirm in our seats. But hear me, let's not fail to finish the book just because it's a hard chapter. I think it's normal to be bothered by these things, but just because we don't like something or just because it makes us feel uncomfortable doesn't mean it's any less true. In order to understand God's justified wrath, it's helpful to understand God's character. In his book, Knowing God, J.I. Packer says this. He says, because God's wrath is rooted in love, it never leads him to impulsive, immoral actions. It is never capricious, self-indulgent, or irritable. It is instead a right and necessary reaction to evil. Would a God who did not react adversely to evil in this world be morally perfect? Surely not. But it is precisely this adverse reaction to evil which is a necessary part of moral perfection. That is what the Bible has in view when it speaks about God's wrath. You say, okay, all right, I see the wrath in this story. The sacrifice, the slaughter of innocents. I see the wrath needing to be taken out. But where's the love? As the band comes, I want to explain to you that in this Passover story, we see blood-stained wood providing a way for each firstborn son to be saved from death. Blood-stained wood over the doorpost, providing a way for each firstborn son to be saved. This is a foreshadow of things to come. Only next time, the wood won't be the wood of a doorway. It'll be the wood of a cross. And the blood on the wood won't be the blood of a lamb. It'll be the blood of God's firstborn son. Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment that the Passover always foreshadowed. In John chapter 1, as Jesus is walking toward John the Baptist looks up and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul tells the church in Corinth, "For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." And in 1 Peter chapter 1, we are reminded, "You were ransomed not with silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot." You want to see the love of God? What kind of God is this who would love the world enough to send his only son to be the sacrifice, to pay the penalty? The eternal plan of the Father to provide salvation for all sons and daughters was to lay down the life of his own son. Listen, pay close attention. Don't miss this. Don't miss what the cost was and what it actually purchased. Here's the purchase and the payment, an eternally innocent sacrifice to purchase eternally sufficient salvation. Do you realize that Jesus is not coming back next Friday to die again? He's not coming back. He died once, a perfect sacrifice for you and for me. The slaughter of an unblemished lamb purchased salvation for us, an undeserving people. This God is not a tyrant. This God is not cruel. He is not heartless. The tyrant is your sin and your circumstances that control your life. God is the one who offers you deliverance. This is who the God of the Bible is. This is who the God of the Old Testament is. Always having this in view of what it was going to cost him. That he would do everything. Listen, I want you to see two things today. God is Lord. If he's not Lord of all, and then he's not Lord at all. And if he's not Lord of all, then he doesn't really deserve to be praised at all, right? If he's not powerful to command everything from us, then he's not that great of a God, right? If he just kind of leaves us up to ourselves to kind of go about our life and kind of figure it out on our own and kind of pick and choose what things we want to follow and obey. That's a pretty small God, right? But he's not small. He's the Lord. He's seated on a heavenly throne right now, surrounded by angels who are worshiping him day and night, and they are singing out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty." This is who God is. He's not a small God. He's not a God who just looks over sin and just neglects it. He deals with it, but the Lord is also the Lamb. He is the one who requires the obedience of sacrifice, and listen, he is also the one who provides it. We're going to take the Lord's Supper today. And this Lord's Supper, this is Jesus' last meal with his disciples before he would go to the cross. And here's what the meal is. It's in the upper room. You guys know the story, right? You know the story. Jesus is in the upper room. He's hanging out with his disciples. You know what holiday they're celebrating? Anybody want to guess? Passover. They're celebrating this Passover holiday that is a remembrance of the way that God delivered his people. That he delivered it, he rescued his people, that in their obedience they sacrificed the lamb, that they were covered, and that God passed over them, rescuing them, and then he delivered them. This is what this Passover meal is all about. And here's what happens with the disciples. They go up into the upper room, and they sit down with Jesus, and whenever we take communion, we take communion all the time, and we don't realize that this is what happened to them. They sit down with Jesus in the upper room, and they know that the Passover required a lamb. And they look out at this table, and they look out at the table, and they see bread. And then they see the wine sitting there on the table. Where's the lamb? Jesus, where's the lamb? Why is there no lamb on the table? How are we supposed to have the Passover if there's no lamb on the table? Well, there was no lamb on the table because the lamb was at the table. There would be, from this day on, there would be no need for a sacrifice. There would be no need for a temporary earthly sacrifice. The innocent, perfect, eternal sacrifice was there. The Lamb of God come to take away the sins of the world. So you and I today, when we take the Lord's Supper, here in just a few minutes, this is a remembrance of God's sacrifice, that he was the perfect sacrifice for all of time. That his sacrifice for you and for me was perfect and eternal. That there's nothing you could do today to make God love you anymore, and there's nothing you've done to make God love you any less. That he has already died, he's already purchased your salvation. That changes everything. That changes everything. That he was the one to demand obedience and the one to fulfill it through his perfect life, his death on the cross, his burial, and his resurrection. This is the beauty of the gospel. God does all the work, and he only invites you and me to accept it. So look at what Jesus says, look what happens in the upper room. There is no lamb on the table. Verse 19 in Luke 22 says, "And he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, 'This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood.'" We have stations set up, one in the back, two on the side. Our worship team is just going to sing. We're just going to sing, and you're going to have an opportunity here throughout this first song, or the second one if you need it, to just deal with God, to respond to God. I want to ask you today, are you living with partial obedience? Maybe you have followed Jesus, but you're just not aware of the cost. Like the cost is not set in for you. Maybe today you've been reminded of the weight of your sin, the magnitude of your sin, and what it costs God, the God of the universe, that it cost him his own son. Listen, don't settle for light faith. You need the real thing today.